And they can probably still hear me, Tyler. But and that was very successful. It was good to hear on those projects. But now it's my pleasure to introduce Kevin Cruz with JEO. And Kevin is going to talk to us about, yes, Jody.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, my name is Joey Spellerberg, Mayor of the City of Fremont. Welcome, everybody. I'll go ahead and open up. This is a special city council meeting in regards to the Elkhorn Township drainage improvements. The Opens Meeting Act is posted on the back wall. I will now do roll call for the city council.
Gibson. Here. Ellis. Here. Vaughn. Gano. Here. Yerger. Here. Jensen. Here. Supra. Here. Legband. Here. 7 council members and present here.
Okay. So I didn't bring that forward because I thought this was a continuation of the meeting itself that we began at 4. If you look at the agenda, and we did the sign in, but I'll acknowledge Pat Tawney. Pat's here with the Dodge County Board of Supervisors, and Bob Bendig, Dodge County Board of Supervisors, myself, Bob Missel, and is Doug here? There's Doug snuck in, Doug Backens. So we've got 4 county board members present. All right. And we'll continue on. Kevin?
Thank you.
Thank you.
So again, good evening, everybody. It's good to see everybody. We just really briefly touched on some of this at the 4 o'clock meeting, but it was really disappointing what everybody's appetite and the nuts and bolts. What we're going to be talking about are here. So what we're going to be presenting on tonight is the findings to date of a Dodge County Elkhorn Township drainage improvement project. It's been going on for quite a while. We'll hit kind of the background and some of those things. And then kind of where do we go from here? So my ugly mug is up there with some contact information. I've got business cards for those that might want them. But as you can imagine, this is a pretty complicated project. So there's a pretty good group of folks back at the office. Colleen Aachen is here. Colleen, I say, is the brains of the operation. She did a lot of the modeling and a lot of the number crunching. And Lalit Jha is here as well, just to give you some ideas. So I mentioned I've got business cards. If you do have questions that come up in the next couple of weeks as you stew on this, please feel free to grab me. So, but the meeting purpose for tonight really is to give the city, the county, and the NRD, all 3 of the project sponsors of this particular project, just an idea of where we're at. It's been a lot of work that's happened with various different staff members at each of those agencies. This is kind of the chance to really update the elected officials with where we're at. And as we talk about what some of our next steps are and what we found to date. So as I mentioned, we're going to really start with some of the project background, who's paying for this project and where did it start and some of those things. And then we'll get into what we found, the study process and the study findings and what some of the alternatives that we developed to actually address some of those deficiencies. And then we'll kind of close things out with some next steps. So as we go through here, please, if anybody has any questions, feel free to stop me and let's get those questions answered. That's the main goal for tonight, is to get all of your questions answered. So just to start with our project background, I think the Joint Water Management Advisory Board just met a few minutes ago. And really that's where a lot of this project started, at least the funding for it. Tom Smith was very proactive and developed a hazard mitigation grant assistance or hazard mitigation grant program, advanced assistance project. And that's a unique opportunity for this area because it's really what we call a scoping project. So they're a great fit for problems in situations like this, where the problem is pretty well known. It floods in this area, but what do we do about it is a very complex issue. There's all kinds of mitigating circumstances, a lot of different stakeholders. That's where projects like this really shine, because what the grant covers that we have to date really is wading through all of the problems, coming up with what some alternates are that will address that, and then really talking through what the preferred alternative is. As we jump into some of the next phases, I think I've got that on an upcoming slide. That's when we get into developing a grant application. And I mentioned this before in the Joint Water Management meeting, but it's a unique opportunity because we have money from FEMA to develop a grant back to FEMA. So we're really using FEMA's money to ask for more money. is really what this ultimately works out in. It's a unique opportunity, and it's a great thing to take advantage of. So we really started in earnest back in May 2021. And up till now, we've got the preferred alternative that we're going to share with you. And then we're going to be wrapping the ultimate project up in roughly June of 2023. So that's our overall schedule. And as we look at what the grant application that Tom put together successfully, it really is to look at the whole Elkhorn Township area comprehensively to develop a comprehensive solution. This is an opportunity not to just pick around the edges and do something to, maybe quiet the coffee shop talk. This is a chance to actually do something. And unfortunately, there's a problem that's been getting worse over the years, and it's been avoided because it's expensive. And that's just an unfortunate situation. But what we're talking about here is a way out, or at least a path forward to where we can hopefully eat this elephant. But so where is Elkhorn Township? I know some of you may be a little more familiar with the geography than others, but Elkhorn Township really has the western boundary of Highway 77, and it goes east all the way to the Elkhorn River. It really starts at the southern end of Dodge County, and it runs north all the way up to County Road S. So there's a number of very critical facilities in this area. There's the hospital, there's a power plant, there's a wastewater treatment plant. There's a number of churches and schools and all those critical facilities that, as you think of what happens when a flood comes, those are the places people go to for safe haven. Another key component of this particular project, and you can see in these blue lines, they kind of crisscross things. This township in particular is, it has a well-defined drainage network, and I kind of call it a spaghetti network of ditches that go everywhere. I got it. Yeah. So it got a spaghetti network of drainage ditches that really go everywhere. They're all interconnected and everything else. So it makes it very complicated to address. This township included a drainage district in the 1920s that really went defunct. I think they ran out of assets, but there were a number of easements identified for these drainage districts. Not all of them, but some of them. But all of those assets ended up going to the county. And it's kind of been in limbo ever since. So now is an opportunity to really look at some of these things. Another key component of this, and I probably will use to point things out. Hopefully everybody can just see the cursor if that's easier for everybody, just the arrow. So Rawhide Creek proper, which I know John Peterson just talked at length about it in the previous meeting, it runs right through the middle of a lot of this area. So that's one of the key things that we'll be talking about later on, is how does Rawhide Creek impact some of this, and what those impacts really are. Another one that I wanted to mention that's kind of right in the middle of this whole thing that I know is on everybody's mind is the pending port authority that is out there, the Inland Port Authority. So that is generally goes from the railroad tracks that run up to Arlington, going south, and then it starts at Highway 77, and then it runs east, and it's in this green light shading here. That plays a role into how we're going to look at potential projects and what things may or may not be viable. So the other thing I wanted to address too is how does this project tie into all of the other things that are going on right now? This is only one of many drainage projects that are under review right now, and a couple of them that John Peterson talked about at length was this orange boundary. It's the Rawhide Creek WFPO project. And that project really looks at the entire Rawhide Creek watershed all the way out to Schuyler. One thing to how we've been differentiating these two projects, because they really overlap in area and they both look at portions of the Rawhide Creek. The Rawhide Creek WFPO project, the intent of that is to really keep floodwaters from the west from getting to town. And the Elkhorn Township project is how do we get water that falls in town out? So that's kind of the distinction of those two projects, at least on a high level, a way to kind of keep them separate. But there also is a Fremont West project that is just kicking off now that we're going to be doing some additional meetings here and getting started on. Has a similar scope to the Elkhorn Township, but it's just for a different area. Really starts at Highway 77 and goes west. So really, where are we at now with this whole process? I mentioned that we're kind of in a transition area or transition phase. And as we really look through this, the things that we've done now really it's evaluating the existing conditions, identifying what those deficiencies are, and then coming up with solutions for that. And then once we have a number of different solutions or alternatives, kind of wading through which ones make sense. They all have pros and cons. There's costs to consider. There's political considerations. There's land rights, and all of those things kind of go into choosing what is the preferred alternative. And that's really right where we're at right now. There's been a lot of work done with the staffs of the various entities. And we have a project that seems to make sense to move on to the next stage. And that's going to make up the bulk of the next few months here as we go forward. It's going to be that grant application. Our grant application is going to be due back to Tom Smith in the county, so we can get it submitted into NEMA. But it's going to be due roughly June of 2023. So that we can use the summer months to fine tune and work back and forth with NEMA and FEMA, so that the final submittal to FEMA is actually in the fall when that happens. But there's a number of different things we're going to be working on over the next few months that all really support that grant application. And as we get into what the grant actually is and some of those things, I'll get into that. But the whole point is what do we do to improve our chances? That's really what the next few months are really all about. The one thing I did want to point out, though, is that at this point with the grant that we have, design, right-of-way acquisition, construction, none of those things are funded as of right now. All of those things will be included in the future grant application. So the first step that I wanted to share with you is the existing conditions flood map. So we developed a pretty robust existing conditions map. What we're showing right here is the 5-year storm. We did run all of the various different storms, both smaller, more frequent, and larger, less frequent storms. And we chose the 5 because it really encapsulates a lot of what most peer communities in Fremont are really trying to deal with when they look at an urban drainage situation. Most communities, whether it's Columbus or Grand Island or any of the kind of river communities, you usually look at that 2-year, 5-year type of storm of how do we convey this through town and out. This is not a floodplain evaluation where we look at the 100-year event or anything on that scale. We're looking at localized heavy rains that actually flood the streets and some of those things. But a few things that we really can start to identify is that all of the areas in blue are areas that are inundated for that 5-year event. And that the darker shade of blue it gets, the deeper that water gets. So you can see a number of the channels that crisscross there right on top of the channel. It's a little darker blue, so you can kind of pick out where those channels are. But there's a number of spots that we can start to identify. There's a big chunk of agricultural production ground right out in here that is inundated. There's a big chunk of already developed residential and commercial properties in town that are potentially inundated on both the northeast part of town and the southeast part of town. And there's, again, some kind of currently developing areas up in this reach right now. Some of that is ag production. Some of it is actually in some stage of development. But again, all of those areas are currently impacted by only a 5-year storm, which is, I had it in my notes, it's like almost 3 inches roughly, give or take, which is, I mean, that I grew up here too. That happens. We're not talking about a 2019 event. And that's the thing that I really want to kind of impress upon people is that with this particular project, we're not looking at that kind of Cinderella type of perfect storm scenario that 2019 was. We're looking for the everyday, probably every year type of rainfalls that just can't get out of town. They get hung up in all of the curb and gutter, storm sewers are all backed up, all of both the urban ditches and the rural ditches, the water's just not leaving the system at all. So, and as we look at a few of this, there are a handful of deficiencies, I guess, that jump out at me. And as I go through this, don't take this as an order of like from bad to worse or anything like that. I'm really just going from the east side to the west side. So the first ones of which are all of these rural ditches, and I'm going to say all of them because they all are problematic. For this 5-year event, what a lot of them are showing is that they're either running bank full or they've already overtopped the bank, which gets into why there's so much ag flooding in this area. So the conveyance of the ditch network is just inadequate. And That includes the ditch network of the ditches along the roadway network, but also those named ditches, some of which the county operates, some of which the NRD operates, some of which are probably just going through farm fields that nobody's really doing much to. But we'll call it the ag network of ditches is one deficiency. Then we have in these yellow dots, there are 5 separate crossings, major crossings of new US 275. Each of those are some order of magnitude undersized. The one thing I will point out is that they're undersized for the condition. If we were to open everything up, they were actually sized based on what the downstream undersized ditch network can handle. So they weren't sending any more water than what the downstream ditch networks can address. But if we were to look at an improvement, that would quickly become a bottleneck. The next one that I'll point out is this magenta dot right here. So another culvert crossing, at least on the southern leg, is at the railroad tracks. At this location, there's actually 2 separate crossings right there. Those are, again, significantly undersized. I think that one has caused some backups very distinctly in the past. And then the final one, I think it's indicative of really the entire urbanized area, is that the vast majority of the city's storm sewer system, both the ditches and underground pipes and all the inlets and the entire collection, it's really undersized. So as we look at that 5-year event, which is consistent with what your peer communities are doing. So that's where we really started in terms of this is the problem we need to solve. And the one nice thing about the FEMA opportunity for grants is we'll get into this, but it's really driven by benefit cost. And the overall goal is to make it as good as you can. Just make it better. And as long as the benefits outweigh the cost, it gets to be an eligible project. So as we've been developing and working on this project, that's what we're trying to do, is really maximize what those are. So as we really look at where some of these deficiencies are happening, we get into some of the impacts of what Rawhide Creek and the WFPO project are doing. We can really divide kind of the problem areas, really doing a northeast half and a southeast half. We really have almost 2 boundaries or 2 barriers there. And they generally, for the higher storms, this isn't the case, but for the lower storm events, they're generally independent until we get quite a ways east where all of those creeks start to come together. So generally speaking, that's the case, that they are somewhat independent. So after quite a few discussions with the group, made up of the sponsors and the various entities, there was a lot of discussion about what are the types of things that we can do to start addressing some of these deficiencies. The areas of the north in that green boundary up in here, the vast majority of these problems are really caused by a significant undersized ditch network and storm sewer network. The problem is all of that private property and all those houses are built right up to it. It is just right there. There's almost no right of way to really deal with some of those things. The other piece that's going on in this portion, which is much more heavily influenced by Rawhide Creek, is this one is beneficially impacted, at least by the projects going on with the Rawhide Creek WFPO. Conversely, as we look at some of the areas in the southern area, the yellow, while there certainly is the storm sewer implications and some of those things, this whole area is really independent of what's going on with Rawhide Creek until we get way out here on at least the eastern third or so of the whole project area. And there's really a lot more room to do things. Some other things of consideration is and Jeff, I saw him here earlier, he could probably tell you quite a bit about the pit flooding that has happened at the power plant. I think there's been some significant damage, and frankly, there's probably been some saving graces of how it wasn't any worse than it was. It's probably true. But sooner or later, we're not going to dodge that bullet. So all of those things together, what was ultimately decided is that there was more of an opportunity to do something in the immediate future with the southeast area. That is not to say that we don't at all recognize that there are significant problems in the northeast area, but as we start developing a project we really need to start having focus, because if we tackle too many different things, we're just going to lose focus and we run the risk of nothing getting done. So what we've developed in our study is really some very high level concepts for the north area, but the south area is the one we really focused on developing. And that's likely what we'll move forward into a future grant application. So what are some of those things that we kicked around to do? So I mentioned earlier that we're eventually the deliverable of this project is a grant application to FEMA. So that's what we need to get to. So we really need to keep in mind what are those eligible things that we can do. It really centers around flood risk reduction, and it has to meet a benefit cost analysis. So as we started working through all the various different alternatives and ideas, it's with that in mind. How do we maximize benefits and make sure that we have more benefits than costs? So I'll go through each one of these independently, but to let you know the idea and the process that we use, we actually look as a first step at each one of these things in a vacuum. So for example, if we only did an alternate channel to the Platte River, if that's all we did and nothing else, what's the impact? If we only did a groundwater dewatering system, what's the impact? What's the impact of a storm sewer only improvement? So we went independently one by one to see what matters and what doesn't. And then I'll give you a preview of where we're ending up. The ultimate project kind of packages a handful of these things all together so we can really maximize those benefits and have the most bang for the buck. And keep in mind, what's really driving that is that earlier slide that I showed, is that we have about 5 different things that are all equally bad. We have ditch network, highway culverts, railroad culverts, city storm sewer, all those things are equally bad. So by fixing any one of them, we really don't see any benefit. So just to go through some of the ideas that we went through. So the first one we looked at was an alternate outlet to the Platte. As you probably remember, that the map where we have Rawhide Creek and all of those spaghetti network of road ditches, they all drain east, southeast to the Elkhorn River. So one idea was maybe we can provide additional conveyance if we just go directly south and get it to the Platte River. So first thing that just really ruled this one out is that the existing ditches, and to give you a point of reference, the existing ditch at Morningside, it's also called the sewer ditch, runs out east. The flow line or the bottom of that ditch actually is lower, or excuse me, it is lower than the Platte River is. So in order to drain to the Platte River, we'd be going uphill. So that right there generally rules out that, because we need this to function with some fluctuation in both Platte River or Elkhorn River, whichever one we're going, because if it's raining in Fremont, it's likely raining in other places too. So this one was actually ruled out from future consideration. Another one that we heard that was worth looking into and having some ideas on is what would happen if there was just a massive groundwater dewatering system for the entire east part of town. So what this would encompass or look like is a dozens of high capacity groundwater wells that all pump groundwater and then discharge it to something else. This would be what's called a non-consumptive use. So this would be a pump and dump situation. We're just pumping water out of the ground, putting it in a ditch. We're not doing anything productive with that water. So one of the big challenges of a system like that is, what do you do with all of that water? So generally speaking, in order to have any meaningful reduction in groundwater levels, we would need to be pumping somewhere on the neighborhood of about 60 to 75 cubic feet per second, which sounds, it's a thing. If you're not in that world, it might not resonate. But what that does is it really doesn't drop the groundwater level regionally. It does at the very close to the well, but regionally, it only drops it really maybe a foot or two, maybe 3 feet if at most. But a bigger problem is, now what do you do with all that 60 to 75 CFS of water? The most logical place to do with it is to dump it back in the ditches that we just showed. They're already way undersized. So ultimately what would be happening is that you would be using up nearly all of the capacity of the ditches 24 hours a day with a pump. So when it does rain, the surface water, the rainwater actually has nowhere to go. So there is a very, very high likelihood that unless you address all of the downstream ditches or potentially pump this all the way to the Elkhorn River, you'd actually be making the problem worse because you now have nowhere for the surface water to go, and you've not really improved things improve things too much. So again, so this one was actually ruled out for further consideration. So the next one we did was really look at what if we just do a massive storm sewer improvement in town. We can start widening the urban ditches. Most of those are pretty much shoehorned into existing right of way, but there would be an opportunity to make all of the storm sewer pipes bigger. That totally is on the table and one of the things we looked at. The big challenge is we're starting at the upstream end of the system, so we're making those things bigger without any way to get the water all the way to the river. We still have deficiencies at the railroad, at the highway, and the rural ditches. It does make things better immediately in the area of where we'd add the storm sewer, but all it does is just dumps the problem downstream on somebody else. So that was not, at least in and of itself, the storm sewer improvement is not something that will work. We'll come back to this, and it does play a role in part of the overall one, but it has to be paired with some of these other things, or it's just frankly not going to work. So another one we looked at is what happens if we created some storage, had a massive detention pond somewhere. So one thing to keep in mind with the detention ponds is that they do a great job of reducing flood risk downstream of wherever the pond is, but they basically do nothing upstream if that's the only thing you do, right? So if we were going to look at an only detention pond alternative, the best place for the detention pond is right where all the homes are that we're trying to save, which is completely counterintuitive. So again, the detention ponds that we looked at on a detention only alternative were west of Highway 275 in the already developed area. And there just wasn't enough open ground or publicly owned ground to really move the needle that much. And then we also saw an issue that it didn't really solve anything if we weren't fixing anything either upstream or downstream. So, but again, we'll come back to this one as well, because when it's paired with other things, it starts to make sense. So another one that we really looked at was, well, we've got these ditches that are running all over in the rural part of the county. What happens if we just clean them out? Right? Like, I think anybody that drives through there will say there's a lot of trees and debris and corn stalks and everything else has built up over time. I think that's a fact that we can't avoid. But if we were to open those things back up, back to their original shape, how much benefit would that really give us? And I think probably the one benefit, or the one thing to point out, is that this is a representative cross-section of what those channels would actually have to be if we're going to pass entirely within the channel that 5-year event. So the way it works out is the existing channel has somewhere in the neighborhood of about 125 cubic feet per second. At that particular cross-section, we would need to pass 590 cubic feet per second to address the 5-year flooding. So the question still remains, if we were to clean out the ditches, would it help? Well, yes, but it doesn't help for the 5-year event. It doesn't help for the 2-year event. It would help for the 1-year event. It'd help for the 6-month event, but where we're going to very quickly overwhelm the system downstream unless we physically make those channels wider. So really that gets into our next option is what happens if we just do that? What happens if we just widen all of the ditches out in the rural part of the county and do nothing else, all the way to the Elkhorn River? So some of you may be familiar, but there was a project to do just that on the books in 1997. And it was a joint city county NRD project that was kicked around. It ultimately fell apart because of some funding and some other things. It's probably not relevant for right now. But what those things would do, it does have a fairly significant impact in the rural parts of the county. And what we'll show here on this map, it's kind of the same color scheme as the one that John had. So these areas of yellow or tan would be areas that would have significantly reduced flood risk for this 5-year event. These areas of blue would be remaining for that same 5-year event. And these would be basically every ditch east of Highway 275 improved dramatically, sometimes 2 or 3 or 4 times as big. So it's when you look at this, there we go. When we look at this, there's a few things that jump out at us. It's like we've got a dramatic reduction here, but when we look upstream of 275, we've got a little blip here that's good. It's yellow is positive for us. We start doing a little bit better at the power plant campus, not a ton, but then there's this whole swath of residential commercial development that sees very little actual benefit in reducing those flood depths. If you really zoomed in on this map, you'd see a little sliver of yellow around the fringe, but it's minor. We're talking reduction of maybe a couple inches up in there rather than feet, which is what we. And the big reason of that is because we've addressed one of those deficiencies, the rural ditches, but the other 3 or 4 we haven't touched. So that's where we got into, okay, we got a lot of things that don't work. That's not very helpful. So what do we get in, like, tell me something that does. So that's where we start packaging these things together. And what we've got, I'll show you several maps, but I wanted to get it out here in a narrative version for those folks that are more text orientated. But really we start with, on the east end, a detention pond that would be proposed somewhere east of Highway 275. The final location of that is yet to be determined. There's a lot of irons in the fire. There's a lot of opportunities out there. We just need to work through some of those things. Then we would need a channel improvement upstream of that detention pond so that we can get more water to the detention pond. Really all the way through up to where the existing channel daylights at 5th and Luther in town. We would also need culvert improvements associated with those channel improvements at US 275 at only one location at Morningside. We're not talking about all 5 of those going up north, but at Morningside. And then also the railroad, which is a significant restriction. But then storm sewer improvements or some of the urban channel cleaning out and maintenance on both 1st Street and 5th Street, which there already is a project that's out there. I think it's in the planning stages of budgeting and some of those things for a 1st Street paving improvement. It'd make perfect sense to do those things at that time. And that's really why we chose 1st Street. So those 2 things can be tied together. But then another big piece of this is the existing channels downstream or east of wherever this detention pond are, all still need cleaned out. So where you would be working with county and NRD and the city to develop a operation and maintenance plan, develop a list of responsibilities, and some timing of when those things need to happen. So as we look at a map, just some perspective. So again, one thing I want to point out is that in this green shaded area is that Port Authority boundary. So the detention pond that we've talked about, the location is not yet determined. So it just has to be east of the highway. It can be half a mile east, a mile east. If we start getting into the 2 and 3 and 4 miles east, it has an impact on the overall cost. But we have some flexibility in there of areas to do. And the same thing with the alignment of this orange new channel that would be up here. If we move the detention pond in a location, we would also need to move the channel so that we drain into it. But what would be done is we look at the highway, we move kind of one step going upstream to the west. These existing culverts through the Diamond interchange here at Morningside, structurally, they're all fine, that they're smaller than what we want. But we did have quite a few conversations with the Department of Transportation. And it ultimately came up that there's no reason for these to be removed and replaced. What actually makes more sense is to have another crossing further to the north. We're trying to hit this little sweet spot in here, whereas you're familiar with that grade. You keep going north, there's a viaduct over the railroad. If we push it south, then we have to have multiple culverts, and that's what they have now. They have 3 culverts through there, through both off ramps or on ramps and the main line. So we want to slide it far enough north so we only have 1, but keep it far enough south so that we're not getting into the massive embankment as the viaduct starts to go up. But what that would happen is right at this location, there would be quite literally a Y in the channel. The south leg would remain in place and usable, and there could be some maintenance and cleanup of this, but in general, it would be used, and there would be a diversion structure right at this black dot to send the majority of water through this new channel into the detention pond. What does go down the south leg of this diversion structure would continue here through these culverts and continue on Morningside the way it always has. But what the point of the detention pond is that as we increase the size and capacity of the systems upstream, we have preliminarily sized that detention pond so that the flows downstream in this Morningside Road ditch, as we go to County Road 26, 27, 28 on down that way, they are less than or equal to what they are today. So as this moves forward into a final design stage, I do think there's an opportunity to increase the size of that detention pond and pinch down the flows even more to show even more of a reduction in flow to those ag areas than what we do now. But what we're kind of showing now is a minimum so that we have no adverse impact downstream. So as we continue north past that diversion structure upstream, we would have new additional culverts at the railroad tracks. The existing ones that are there are probably 25% size that they should be, maybe less. Continuing that ditch up to First Street here, and then ultimately to Fifth and Luther up here. So the orange in this line would be an open channel, a new ditch. The yellow would be a new city storm sewer system that right now would capture water up here and allow the Fifth Street ditch to continue to flow. What happens, Fifth Street ditch is just undersized altogether. So we'll have a parallel system so that water can find its own path and continue down to the new system. So, so what this does, if we look in here, and I've got one that zoomed in a little bit too into the more urban areas. So don't squint too hard. I just wanted to give you a global picture. But what this does, again, this detention pond is certainly up for discussion about where that's located. It can go anywhere east of 275. And if you really zoomed in here, you'd see some little slivers of yellow, which again, yellow is a reduction in flood risk, but not a ton. So what we were looking at with this detention pond scenario is somewhere around 400 acre feet, which is fairly, I mean, it's a big pond. Now the math of that can be cut up a lot of different ways. So you could say we want a pond that's 200 acres big, but only 2 feet deep, or we can say we want something that's 400 acres big, but only 1 foot deep. You can cut up that math however you want. We need a volume of 400 acre feet. So generally speaking, the deepest we can go before we get into things like groundwater and some of those things is somewhere around the 6 foot, give or take area. If we start getting into that, we could get into some seasonal impacts of groundwater. So if we just say for easy math, or if they call it 5, so 400 divided by 5, we'd be looking at 80 acres of detention. Again, similar to the one John mentioned, the idea would be that there would be a flow metering device, whether that's a manually operated gate, whether that's a riser structure. We can talk through a lot of different options there. There would be some structure that would not allow water to get from the detention pond back into the Morningside ditch until we were ready for it to do so. But the one big thing you do see is that now all of this area up in here, starting with the power plant, going all the way up here to just touch past military, that's all yellow now. So what that means is there's significant flood risk reduction for those areas. And that for this 5-year event, they are not at risk for flooding. As the events intensify, when we start getting to 25, 50, 100, then it's a little bit different story. But keep in mind, again, we're trying to solve something that for peer communities, you have a 5-year conveyance of how do we get water out of town. So when we look at this next slide, really it's the same information as I just zoomed in on the kind of the urban areas of town so that you can really start getting a picture of what this is. So we have street and structural damage all through here. There's a number of churches, I think, in there. I think there's a school or two. We have the power plant facility right here that would see several feet of water surface elevation reduction. So ultimately what happens, we talked about with John's project in Rawhide, how these detention ponds really function. the siting of this detention pond is very critical because really what we're doing is we're taking all the water that's ponding here in town, we're moving it to a dedicated, defined place that is set aside, operated, and maintained as a detention. That's really what you're doing. You're just defining that that work. So a few more details on this particular area. So there's roughly 300 separate parcels in this particular area that would see flood risk reduction by this particular project. So, so that's the good news. At least there's a project that we can do. It's going to reduce flooding. It's going to do some good things. Now's the challenge of how do we pay for this? So as I mentioned, the ultimate deliverable of this particular project is a grant application to FEMA. So there's a number of different programs that are out there that could apply. Some of which you're probably familiar with. There's the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. That's actually the program that funded the study piece of this. There's also the Flood Mitigation Assistance. There's also BRIC, so Building Resilience in Infrastructure and Communities. So any of those are on the table, as well as anything else we can come up with. But the ultimate goal is to get to a FEMA application. And as we go through here, we're also going to be developing kind of a plan B or backup. Or if the FEMA funding doesn't come through, the one thing to keep in mind is that these are applications. They can say no. Funding for the next phase with any of these programs, any of the other programs, it is not guaranteed. The one that makes the most sense for us to pursue is BRIC. It's that Building Resiliency and Infrastructure and Communities. That is a nationwide competitive process. So we'll have to be competing against projects on the coast, Gulf Coast, Florida, hurricane areas, landslide areas in California. Those are the kind of projects that we're going to be competing against. But there have been projects in Nebraska funded through this program. Recently, the Papio NRD had a dam out by Gretna that they're getting funding with this particular program. So what does that actually look like if we go down this brick road, yellow brick road, maybe, I don't know. So the big thing about this is that it is a 75%, 25% split. So federal share is 75%, and the 25% is anything non-federal. So non-federal mean a lot of different things. It can mean any kind of state money. It can mean anything local. It can be city, county, NRD. It can be private donations. It can be ringing the bell at the Christmas time. It can be anything that's non-federal. So I know Mayor and I talked a little bit earlier. One of the things that the city council folks are probably considering ARPA money that has been distributed to the city. ARPA money is eligible as a local share because it went through the state. Once it went through the state, it lost its federal tags. It is now the state money, and the state gave it to the city. That's how that chain of command went. So we have confirmed the ARPA money is available for those things. But the one thing that's really going to drive this, I hit on this a couple of times, is the benefit cost is probably the number one critical item. If we do not have a positive benefit cost, it's a non-starter. We aren't getting anywhere with that. And there's a few ways to do that. So FEMA has a defined methodology that if you want their money, you play by their rules. That's how that works. The bottom line is you monetize all of the benefits you can. So it's things like structural flooding damage, social damage. There's a number of different additional ones. So what we've done at this point, since we're at a screening level right now, as of November 2022, we picked some of the big rocks. The big rocks are the structural damage, the social damage, and even I have on another slide some environmental benefits. There are a bunch of other benefits that we will be calculating and adding in here over the next few months, but they are not going to swing the needle nearly as much as the structural damage and the social damage. So as we went through the screening process, we wanted to make sure that we're kind of narrowing this down. We started with 5 projects, then we got to 3, then we got to 2, now we're at 1. The next few months, we're really going to be nailing down the grant application and the benefit cost analysis for this one. So that's how you do the benefits. The costs are relatively straightforward. It's the things like the administrative costs. So any design, permitting, administrative costs, You can even have some costs for administration of money. If there's some loans or some of those things that are out there, those can be rolled into it. It's real estate acquisition is an eligible expense at that 75-25 match. Any of the construction costs. And then a big piece of this is that in order for FEMA to buy off on the project and ultimately fund it, having an actual agreed upon long-term operation and maintenance plan that's funded is another critical element. So it has to be funded. We can't just say that we're gonna make Scott go out there with push lawnmower and deal with this. That's not practical. So having that done is pretty critical, but those costs are rolled into the actual application as well. So as we look at this, the first side of the equation is benefits. How do we come up with that? So a few key elements, at least as we've got it in concept right now. We're looking at 300 urban properties that we're seeing flood risk reduction for, which is a pretty significant amount, right? And when we add up all that yellow area in the rural part, it actually ends up being 105 acres. If we are to take some advantages of maybe building the detention pond bigger, I think we can shrink that, or we can add to this number by shaving off even more flows out of the detention pond. But our biggest benefit really coming out of this is the structural damage avoidance of between 65 and 75 million. So you're going to see ranges on here. Keep in mind, it's the goal over the next few months to get that from a range to a number. So that's where we're heading next. What the structural damages really are a function of is how much are you reducing the flood depth at any one structure, and what's the value of that structure. So the value we pulled right off of the county assessor's information, and the flood depths we pulled right off of our model. So in the next few months here, we are going to be working on doing some actual surveying so that we can have real first floor elevations. We pulled a lot of those since we have 300 properties that we're looking at. Pulled a lot of that information off of available information like LiDAR. So we're going to be firming that up and getting to a little better number. But I actually feel it's going to be closer to 75 million. Another big one is social damage. So what that really is, I call it pain and suffering. Is kind of how I look. This would be if your house is one of those that's damaged, you can't live there. You have to go to a hotel. You have to displace your family for a short period of time. That's what's captured in those things. Environmental benefits, I have them up on here because it's not an insignificant amount of money. I don't know that we're necessarily counting on it yet. As we go forward, we want to make our best case to FEMA we can. But the environmental benefit would potentially be in cleaning up any of those channels and the detention pond, and it'd be really habitat restoration. If he was going to give us credit for it, we might as well take it. That's kind of the thought process of that. So ultimately, when we get in here on the screening level, just those big rocks, we're looking at somewhere between $70 and $85 million. Some other additional benefits that we're going to be looking at as we go forward here really get into impacts to utilities. I already mentioned in this area, we've got power plant, sewer plant. I mean, there's some big things going on there. Loss of utility or loss of service is an eligible benefit as well, and it can be fairly significant. The challenge is you really get into an argument about how did you come up with that number? So also impacts to publicly or nonprofit owned property. You remember those 300 properties, I pulled property values right off of the assessor's information for schools, for churches, and those things. That county assessor doesn't have property value because it's non-taxable. There's some pretty expensive schools and churches and those things out there. They're all eligible. We just have to get those costs a different way. Insured value is one of those potential ways, but that'll definitely benefit things. Then there's impacts to the city and county road network, whether it's loss of aggregate on the county roads or maybe the subgrade gets completely damaged because of high water. All those things are eligible expenses. And then the one big one that it is a benefit that's out there that I want to certainly acknowledge. The challenges that FEMA does not really acknowledge it as well as I would like is how they calculate the loss of agricultural production. So if we have a field that's maybe flooded with a foot of water for maybe a week or so, or an extended period of time, I think anybody that's been in that industry knows that's going to have some significant impact. FEMA is built around funding things in more of an urban environment. the NRCS, the funding program that John talked about earlier tonight with the WFPO program. They're built for the ag flood protection. They don't like to talk all that well. So we will keep that on there. We're going to be asking for it, but I don't want to craft a project that is dependent on that to get us over the hump. So, so that's the benefit side. So if we really look at the cost side, so obviously this is a big project. I'm sure you're all expecting a big number. Right now, I've got this broken up into 3 separate phases. One of the big things that we're going to be doing over the next few months is having conversations with the city and the county, primarily the NRD. Might not have as much to weigh in on, but how does this animal get broken up? Just because FEMA looks at it as one overall project, it doesn't necessarily need to be one project in the eyes of the city and county and NRD. The city could lead this piece, the county could lead that piece, the NRD could lead that piece. That's what we need to figure out. So this phasing is likely to get cut up quite a bit. But the bottom line, when we're looking at an all-in number, we're really looking at a $55.4 million improvement. What that includes is not only the construction, but all the administrative fees, the percent, we just applied a straight percent to it. It also includes land acquisition costs, permitting costs, all those various different things, so you can have kind of an all-in project cost. So what we look at when we do this preliminary benefit cost analysis, you do all this work and it all boils down to one number. So all you do is divide your benefits by your costs. And as long as that number is greater than 1, you're eligible. So ultimately what we have is we have a cost of 55 million and benefits on the low end of 70 million. So that's a positive number. It's a 1.27 to 1.55 with where we're sitting at right now. Now we have some additional benefits to add in there. The way the process does go, having been through it, FEMA is going to always find something to ding you on. They're going to try to take something out. So we do not want to go in the process with a benefit cost of like 1.01 because they will find a way to kick you out. We have to have some fluff in this thing. There again, we don't want to go in with too high. It's a game, right? If we go in with too high, the number, they're not going to believe that it can possibly be that much. So they'll find another way to kick you out for that one too. So we have this sweet spot of about 1.5.
I'm sure you've done projects with this before. Is that better cost ratio? Is that in the ballpark? Is that something similar to work with numbers like that before?
Yeah, so I've had projects in Nebraska and Lincoln and right 3 or 4 of them in Lincoln, Nebraska City, all over. Generally speaking, if you're in that 1.5 ballpark, you're sitting pretty good. It doesn't do you any more to have a benefit cost ratio of like 3. They don't give you bonus points, right? All you have to do is the project beneficial, and that's the metric. So we've got a handful of them in Lincoln that are funded at anywhere kind of a 1.2 to 1.5 scale. I did have one that was over 2, but that's because frankly we had incredibly low bids. That the bids came in really low. On the backside, we paid for it later because the contractor we got what we paid for. So yes, so this puts us in the ballpark of being reasonable to move forward. So, and that's where we're at right now. So what this means, if we just look at that $55 million, it's a tough pill to swallow for sure. But how does that translate to this federal, non-federal place? So the grantee has the option to adjust that range. The federal cap just can't be more than 75%. So, you could do a 70-30, you could do 50-50. It depends on how you're doing. I think the rules are being tweaked right now to how that might impact the fundability or your actual selection for the project. But ultimately what it looks like is you're in the neighborhood of $41.2 million from the federal side of the ledger. And that would mean that that's $13.8 million roughly from the non-federal side of the ledger. But one thing that is important with that is that is not one calendar year by any stretch of the imagination. This is a big project. So generally, if we look at how the project would likely go, you got probably a 2-year to 2.5-year design stage. And then we've got some of these other things with the asterisks, the real estate and the permitting. Those two things can be somewhat consecutive or concurrent rather. That they can kind of be working on the same schedule. We don't need to get done with one before we move on to the next one necessarily. So that's why I've got a range there in the end. And if you were really diligent, added all those numbers up, don't get to 54 to 84 months. It's because some of those things we can do at the same time. We can be working on real estate acquisition at the same time we're finalizing design. We can be working, you'd need to be working on permitting at the same time you're going forward with design. But generally speaking, you're looking at somewhere between 5 and 7 years from the point that FEMA says, yes, you're funded, go forth. So that could potentially be 5 budget cycles on the quick. So what do we do next? I think where are we at in terms of a project team and some of the next steps that we're tackling? So this is the action item list that Colleen and I have. These are the things we're working on. The next slide you'll see is ones that I think you guys need to work on, or at least the city, county, and NRD need to work on. So the first thing is get that FEMA grant application going. And all of these other elements are really to support that, make our chances better, or just a minimum, we need to have this information to get going. I will say that with the exception of the second one, which is develop a funding plan. And that one really is our plan B. What happens since this is a highly competitive project? We're going up against things like hurricane states and California and New York and everywhere else. What if we don't get the money? So we're going to be looking at potentially a modified phasing plan, stretching that out over potentially a longer time frame. Other grants that are non-FEMA related, we're going to be working on putting some of those things together for that. But we also have the real estate and regulatory review of that preferred alternative. So the real estate review really gets into that topic that I mentioned, that there are a bunch of easements that are on file at the courthouse that frankly nobody's looked at since 1920. I'll admit, I dug them up. So we're working on identifying where do we have easements and where do we not have easements, so that we can give that to the county. The county is actually the title holder of those easements. But it's kind of a convoluted mess of what do we own and what do we not own. And looking through it already, it is not consistent all the way, starting at one end of the channel and working all the way down. It's this quilt work of, we've got 2 in a row and then we miss 1 or 2. And we got 2 in a row again and we miss another one. But that will give us an idea of which ones are missing. Where do we need to have conversations so that we can develop an operation and maintenance plan with the rights to actually be out there, so that we can do that. The next one is a big one as well, because we've got entities that are not actual sponsors that are impacted pretty heavily with this project. The first being the Port Authority. I showed several times the location of that and the fact that the detention pond is going to have to be located east of the highway somewhere, and that impacts the Port Authority on some level. We've already had conversations with them. We're kind of in a holding pattern until some of that is finalized. And we know where that one's going. But I do think those conversations have been very positive, and I think there's a great opportunity to leverage this detention pond with what the Port Authority construction is going to have to do to comply with other city buildings. In fact, they're going to need their own detention ponds. So can we combine those things and allow them or carve out some storage in this detention pond for the offset of potentially that development? So those are some things that are out there. And then we also have the Department of Transportation and the railroad. We've had preliminary conversations with both. Conversations with the DOT have been pretty positive, but frankly, nobody signed on the dotted line, and they haven't decided to show up with any money either. So we've got momentum, but now it's kind of finalizing where exactly we're putting this. Is there an opportunity to pull them in as a funding partner? I'm not sure that's going to work out based on the conversations I've had with them, but it's worth asking. And the next one is the Union Pacific Railroad, which is going to be a challenge in and of itself. But then we're going to be beginning right after the first of the year. We'll get through the holidays. We're going to be doing a fairly significant public engagement campaign. The first piece of that is we're going to be meeting one-on-one with a lot of the landowners so that we can talk about impacts to their particular property. And those impacts might be beneficial impacts from just a flood reduction, like showing them and being clear with them what the good things about the project are. But there may also be some conversations, depending on how the Port Authority ends up, where all that lands, about either easement or acquisition of portions of that ground for detention. So once those are wrapped up, we will be holding more of a town hall, public open house type thing here in town somewhere. And we're looking for that public open house to be somewhere in that February to March timeframe, so that we can incorporate all of that feedback and also use that as support to show that we went through the process for the grant application. So I promised that you guys had some to-do list items. So here's the things that I think we need to start thinking through. So one of the things that is going to be needed for the grant application before it's final in September, we need to have a better idea of where is the local money coming from. We don't have to have it in a bank account or an escrow account or anything like that. We just have to have a strategy identified. And also, along with that strategy would be any outside grants that might be out there, or any kind of interlocal agreements that might be in the works or in a discussion. So that's going to be a big piece of the things we're going to have to start working towards. And as I said, I don't need it today, tomorrow, or anything like that. It's really, that has to be done as part of the grant application. So the purpose of that is that FEMA doesn't want to authorize a multi-million-dollar project relying on 25% funding from the local side that's not there. If for whatever reason the local money, the one entity didn't talk to the other and they made some assumptions, you can come up with all kinds of different permutations of the way that could go wrong, but that's what that's trying to avoid. The next one, and this I want to give a little bit of kudos to the city staff. I think they've done a very good job of this recently, but it's strictly enforcing the current laws that are on the books, or the resolutions on the books. So the city of Fremont does have building criteria that's for sizing storm sewer and culverts and ditches, but also detention criteria, making sure that as this project, it's got a lifespan, it's really going to be years before we really get anything built on the ground. We need to make sure this problem doesn't continue to get worse in those few years. So making sure we strictly comply with the rules we've already got is going to be pretty important. Sure.
Rules we already have. I understood the city engineers been working for some time on revised rules and procedures in that regard that the council has yet to adopt. So are you working off of the official ones that we have today, or taking into account the ones that would be implemented if that actually? Because I know he's been working with those, even though they're not.
Sure. So at a minimum, it's the ones we have today. The ones that are being kicked around or considered, I think, are even a little more restricted, maybe in terms of detention sizing and some of those things. So that will only help. So, but at a bare minimum, we need to apply what is already on the books. That's kind of the bare minimum.
But would it be helpful if those were pushed through and actually were on the book?
Some of the big things that would be the most helpful are identifying the corridors for those existing main ditches, kind of steady network, especially in that northern area, and making sure that those corridors are set aside so we don't continue to encroach and build houses right on the base. And then the third one there, which I think is another good one for the city. I think Jennifer and Jody have been doing a really good job. Floodplain management in Dodge County is a little bit of a challenge because the floodplain maps have a lot of discrepancies, unfortunately. So there are a handful of best available information that are much more detailed models than what the current FEMA flood insurance study has. So I'd strongly recommend kind of using that information kind of help guide the development process when setting things like first floor elevations and some of those things. Because the floodplain information in this part of the county is a little bit of a challenge. And part of what that last line on there is, I think it's worthwhile outside of this project, but it's worthwhile starting to have a conversation about how do we consolidate some of those and maybe get a new floodplain map for the town that actually reflects reality, so that you can use it for development. The residents can actually be aware of what the risks really are and really are not. And then we can go forward with that. There's a handful of ways to skin that cat. But in general, I think it's be worth thinking through, how do we get there? So again, this is the same schedule slide I had before, but really it gets into next few months are going to be a lot of activity. And it's getting that grant application done and all of the supporting information that goes along with it. Then between July and September, we work with the state agency NEMA to address any of their concerns. The way it works is we get NEMA's buy off and support. Once NEMA's happy with it, then it goes to FEMA, and then we do it all again. Should go to FEMA, federal level, in the fall, sometime around September. With a project of this size and scale, I'm estimating that it's going to be between 12 and 15 months, but frankly, it would surprise me if it's 12 months. FEMA on a project of this scale, they're gonna dig into it. So there will be a lot of RFIs or requests for information back and forth about all the various different number crunching that went on. We need to be able to respond to those things. So that's what that 12 to 15 months really is. It's just answering all of their questions and making sure we put our best foot forward. And then once all of that is done, that's when you can actually start the design of the project. So likely if we go back to our schedule thing I had on here, starting this technical design that at a minimum would be 24 months. That's probably, you're looking at 18 months from even starting that piece. So with that, I don't have anything else prepared, and that kind of gives you an idea of what we're actually doing right now with this particular project, and then where we're going over the next few months. So if anybody does have any questions, I'd be glad to answer them as best I can. Otherwise, I've got some contact information if anybody has that. I do have, if anybody wants some of the maps and figures, I know we're really hard to read up there. I've got some hard copies of them for folks if anybody would like one. Sure.
I think I missed how you mentioned the ARPA funds. How are those applying to this project? For what phase or what part?
I don't think any of that's determined. Maybe one of the city staff can weigh in on that. I was just mentioning that ARPA funds are an eligible funding source for this. So I don't know if the city has any determination of what those may be used for or not.
Not at this.
There's a couple of them back there. So
I like the idea that you're concentrating on that southeast section of town, especially our power plant. Is there a probability at all that power plant went offline, or is there redundancy so that if that didn't happen, Fremont would still be served?
right. So Jeff, you may want to chime in on
Yeah,
that.
there's all kinds of possibilities that could go on. But the power plant, the way it actually handles the flood water, we've been in there where water's coming in the front door. It's coming in, all of our duct banks coming in. We have pumps we have redundant pumps that are pumping the water out to keep the basement dry. If that were to fail, if we lose power to the power plant, the basement's gonna flood with water, all the equipment's gonna be done, we're offline. Now, we do have tie lines in other areas of town that would still support those, electric supply to the residents. Depending on circumstances, a thunderstorm or something where it takes out a tie line and lightning shot, then there is a potential that a section of town would be without power. But the power plant is susceptible to a lot of water damage in the event that some of our pumps were to quit running.
I was just thinking if we were to lose power in a section of town, I was just imagining how many people have some pumps that they weren't operating.
Most people in that area are gonna have some pumps.
So that would impact the damage assessment in this study too.
It totally would, and those would be benefits that we're going to be exploring. How do we tabulate those things? But those are all risks we want to mitigate with the project, right? And that's the whole point of the thing, is how do we reduce risk as much as possible.
And we do have other infrastructure involved in this area too. We have a water plant, which is on the other side of the railroad tracks, so that helps the water facility. But we have the wastewater treatment plant just down the road, right along that creek. That we need to protect.
Did you get your question answered?
Yeah, I'm just trying to get a good idea of our chances of getting that. What's your track record?
So the BRIC program is very new. So the West Fremont project that we talked a little bit about at the other project is another scoping evaluation to do the same thing on the west side of town. That's actually a BRIC project. So Tom Smith at the county level was able to get that money and kudos to him, he did a great job. The Gretna project that Papio NRD did with the dam, I think is the only one that I'm familiar with in Nebraska that's been funded so far. I think BRIC has only been around for maybe 2-3 years, is that right?
Yeah,
So,
but Kevin has a very good track record of work and getting projects that were design and construction. I have been part of at least 4 projects, which is again, getting study like what we are getting from FEMA for reevaluation is relatively easier than getting money to build something. Kevin has been part of a lot of those. So again, from what we can control is make a good application. And what a lot of will depend on how many, the competition is nationwide. So generally, the good thing is that, so historically, the BRIC fund, so 3 years ago, that nationwide was $500 million. Last year, it was $2 billion. One of the things they have changed in law that every time there is a disaster, some portion of the money, whatever in that disaster damage goes into the funds. Fund is getting bigger, the pot is getting bigger. That's the good news. But again, how many good applications are coming nationwide will depend where we, how it will be ranked.
yeah, so the ones we have been successful on are the hazard mitigation grant program, and I think, well, it's right, we've gotten 4 or 5 of those. BRIC is kind of the evolution of hazard mitigation in that it allows for a bigger dollar project. Hazard mitigation grant program wouldn't be a good option for something on the scale of a $55 million
So
project.
before, correct, maximum was 10 million. This maximum is 50 million federal share. So we wouldn't be even applying for it because if it was not the new funding system.
Is there?
Got top picture in my corner, and I had trouble keeping the kids out. They loved it. They're not now, I've been trying for 50 years to get something done with that ditch.
And that, I think, is a testament to this is a big problem, and the reason it's never been fixed before is it's hard and it's expensive. Sure.
Comment and a question. First of all, I think you probably work with put this together. I know there are a few of us homeowners here who live in the nasty blue swath across the southeast corner of the power plant. So, I mean, that's exciting for us, of course, to reduce that risk. The question I have is currently a pool construction project happening right across the street from us. The land was raised this past week, probably 2 feet-ish in there. That we've relied, or our neighborhood has relied on that property to hold water in heavy rainfall all these years. We've been there 17 years. So our concern at the moment is that land's been raised. We're already kind of sitting in a hole, if you will, because you have to go up out of our neighborhood to the road. And the school existing is not going to be torn down for at least 2 or 2.5 years. So I guess, is any of this calculating or taking into account that change in our neighborhood?
Right, so I know that particular development did go through the subdivision review for detention and all of those things that I mentioned. That city's been doing a good job of implementing those here recently, so it did go through that. When we're looking at available areas for detention and some of those things, that's kind of where there are no open areas to speak of in kind of that part of southeast. So we did take into account all of the flows off of those sites and all all those, you know, all of that contributing water and how it flows through the system. So. So yeah, I think you are absolutely right. From that part of town, it's uphill in all four directions. So.
Great. And it's getting flooded. We've never had water in our house in 17 years, so I think the next 2 years, if the city's been built.
Yeah. Sure.
In the same areas, dog, mark. And I don't know, make window landscape first school. And I talked with the superintendent of the school, and he was said, oh, you're mention of on the things for okay. However, he said, it's gonna be designed to take care of the runoff from the roads and the enlarged parking lot and drop off area. So, but what has not been addressed is that this field that they're putting all this dirt in was, like Don said, was acting as a retention pond. So when it all is said and done, a natural retention pond could be gone. And nothing kind of got been done about. I'm kind of upset that the city has allowed this to happen without having looked at it ahead of time and said, hey, whoa, wait a minute, you know, let's take another look at this area that's been such flood zone here. And instead it's just go ahead, build your school there, and then we'll tear down the old one. I mean, it's a great idea. I don't think it was totally.
Thank you.
They pretty much have
Okay.
done that, but there are the 3 acres the city bought, it's just east of the Luther Ditch. When you talk about an 80-acre retention pond, 3 acres is peanuts, but could there be a temporary pond built in there to dump from the ditch instead of having it overflow, which is what that school area was picking up?
So yes, there were, I didn't bring that map with me, but there were, whether it was publicly owned or some kind of open or vacant area in that part of town. Yes, those things were there. Would those things help? Yeah, a little bit, but what we have is an opportunity with this program to actually get a solution. So I think that those things are great to do as maybe a stopgap measure.
Yes.
Some of those things might be worth looking into.
When we're talking 5 to 7 years.
Yeah.
Maybe more, why let that land sit there for now if we can take advantage of it?
Those are certainly potential ideas.
Yeah, Kevin, considering the length of time of this, I know in the economic part of it, you're assuming some increase in costs and inflation and all those things. I mean, I know that's a challenge and it's hard to anticipate that, but I mean, as property values could go down or go up, I guess
Right.
how, I know it's a challenge, but I mean, I know you get some fluff in there, but then
Right, so.
still.
So you're absolutely right. So when we, right now in 2022, with the state of the economy is probably more challenging than it's been in a long time. We used to have this pretty linear progression upwards, and now we're doing different day to day, depending on which radio station you listen to. So the way the standard process works is you look at the lifespan of the project. For a project like this, is 25 years. You can ask for an additional up to 50, but the standard is 25 years. So what we would look at, if we look back at that flood map, all of those 300 different parcels, we look at what is the monetized benefit over the course of those 25 years. So if there's what we want to see, well, it's this double-edged sword. Nobody wants to see flooding, but if we're going to help our benefit cost thing, what you get more benefits if you have flooding in a smaller, more frequent event than you do like a 2019 type of thing. Statistically, that's very rare. A 2 or 3 inch rain that floods out a handful of houses is pretty common. So what we take is all of those things over the lifespan and get them into 2023. We'll do $2023. And that's how we do our comparison. So we are building in our cost opinions. There was a 30% contingency built in on that. And again, in $2023. So that contingency is for a lot of the detailed things that we haven't even gotten into yet, like utility impacts and locations and some of those things. But a lot of it, probably half of that is just fluff. Just, we want to make sure that we have enough room in there. The costs opinions, or excuse me, the benefits I mentioned were driven for the most part off the property values, and property values. It's hard to know what's going on. If there's a huge crash coming, we'll have to see where that's at. But what they've been determined on right now is exactly what's in the assessor's 2022 database. So historically, we could count on those continuing to creep up, and they were keeping pace or more than what the inflation we saw. So the way this works is if we make the assumption like we are going to get funded, we've got a grant application gets submitted in September. By the time we roll around to September 24, FEMA gives us the letter that we need saying we've got funding, tells us to go forward with our design. We spend the 2 years on design. Then we do another BCA with all of the updated information we have. We now have a final design. We've got actual quantities and all of those things we need. We know what the land costs are. We've got all of that calculated in there. And then we go and bid the project, build the project. And then there's a third BCA that's done at the end of the project with all of the actual costs. If we had any changes, any modifications, debits or credits, that's all accounted for in the final, that third benefit cost analysis, which is why we want to have something that we're kind of in that 1.5, 1.3 to 1.5 fluff. So in case anything fluctuates, we've got some room to breathe, and we're not having to, cut a massive thing out of the project, because I can tell you when we start cutting things out of the project, yes, you can cut costs, but you're also going to cut benefits. It's just not going to work as well. So yeah, it's a challenge. We're kind of in uncharted times, but I think the big thing we can do is make sure we've got fluff in there. The big one is the 30% contingency. And when you're looking at 30% on $50 million, it's not a small amount of money. So.
Kevin, great job.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank
job.
you.
Very informative. Clearly a lot of work's been done. A lot of work still needs to be done, maybe a little bit of luck as well goes along with it. But I want to thank everybody for taking the time to be here tonight. Thanks to JEO, Lee, for your team putting everything together. Mayor, you want to say anything?
Yeah, no, I'll echo what Chairman Missel said. I want to thank JEO and Kevin. I think this is based on a 5-year storm event, right? Well, we obviously all went through 2019, which was a disaster of, incredible proportions, something we hope never happens again. But if there's, one thing kind of good that came out of that is the formation of the Joint Water Management Board, and all the projects that you saw tonight. We're working on West Fremont, the Rawhide Creek, the Elkhorn Township. All that has come out of the flood and working together in a collaborative way with all these local organizations. And so I just want to commend the folks here that have been part of that process. And we do have a long ways to go. I will say, obviously FEMA was involved with the flood, so they should be familiar with the area, right? That should help our application, I would think. And, there is an unprecedented amount of money. There was $48 million in the Rawhide Creek that is possible, as well as a 75% up to. So if, this is the time. If there's a time to do it after all that we've been through and done it, it's going to have to be right now. So we just got to find a way as a community to work together to figure out how we get it done. So, and move forward. So thanks, Bob. Appreciate it. Thank you, JEO. Yep.
Yeah. Last thing I'll say is I do have some maps over here, and I'll put some business cards out here too for anybody to find out.
Move to adjourn. Second by Lane Van. Okay. Tyler. See you, buddy. Gibson. Burn. Say yes. Alice.
Oh, interesting.
Is he again?
Yeah. Jensen?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. We'll go on. Interesting, huh? Oh, man.
Yeah.